Hello everyone, welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. The China-US economic and trade talks have achieved unexpected results, with both sides agreeing to significantly reduce tariffs within 90 days. Naturally, the most excited reactions came from businesses in both countries. On May 12th, the Wall Street Journal noted that as soon as news broke of the agreement between China and the US, a number of American companies that rely on Chinese imports acted quickly, seizing this valuable opportunity to rush their backlogged goods from China to the United States. Many American companies also remain wary of Trump's tariff policies, complaining that Trump's unpredictability has made business planning extremely difficult and added too many uncertainties for the future. To avoid the Trump administration's tariffs as high as 145%, Florida-based toy company Basic Fun had frozen all shipments from China, resulting in toys piling up in Chinese factories. The company's CEO, Jay Foreman, described how, at 4 o'clock in the morning, when his phone screen lit up with the news that China and the US had reached an agreement, he immediately jumped out of bed to contact suppliers and requested that shipments be sent out at once. Foreman said it was necessary to immediately get in touch with the Chinese freight companies to arrange for the factories to release the goods and also to book space on container ships right away. According to a report released on May 12th by a container shipping information company, the easing of trade tensions came earlier than many had expected, which will drive a surge in trans-Pacific shipping volumes over the next 3 months. Since the rebound in shipping volume coincides with the traditional summer shopping season in the United States, shipping costs are expected to soar in the near future. The report states that carriers have already announced in advance that they will impose a trans-Pacific peak season surcharge of $1,000 to $2,000 per 40-foot container, with implementation as early as May 15th. This means that the shipping rates for containers bound for the U.S. West Coast will rise to over $35 million. Lars Johnson, the founder of a freight company, said that since many companies have already accumulated a large backlog of goods, shipping demand will increase significantly. He pointed out that the 90-day suspension period will end in the middle of the U.S. summer shopping season, so American importers may seize this opportunity to stock up on more goods in the coming months. Under the influence of the Trump administration's tariff policies, cargo volumes at U.S. ports have plummeted in recent weeks. However, Johnson warned that after 3 to 6 weeks, a surge in freight volume could once again cause congestion at U.S. ports. Foreign media pointed out that as shipping capacity returns to trans-Pacific routes to regions outside the United States are also expected to benefit. As of noon on May 13th, the index futures contracts for container shipping from Shanghai to European ports in June and August had risen by 7.9% and 12.8% respectively. To briefly summarize, first, Trump was under significant pressure from these businesses before. Without an agreement, there will be shortages on American store shelves. Second, we cannot rule out Trump's short-sightedness. When he saw that supplies were about to run out and feared social unrest, he rushed to make a deal with China. Then, after businesses hurried to stock up, he might tear up the agreement and force other countries to decouple from China. Third, the problem is that supply chains cannot be established under such unstable conditions. Excluding China from the global supply chain is actually extremely difficult because it takes more than 10 years of continuous investment to build a supply chain. Finally, there is the harm done to the United States itself. The United States and its market have become the biggest sources of instability and uncertainty in the world, making it even harder to attract long-term investment. As a result, economies will avoid placing all their hopes on the US market alone, which in turn weakens America's hegemonic position. Trump can be said to be tearing down his own Great Wall. In addition to the business community's concerns, major economies have also been thrown off balance by the outcomes between China and the US. Japan, for example, has admitted that it is closely monitoring the results of the China-US talks and will thoroughly study their impact. Currently, the outlook for Japan-US tariff negotiations remains unresolved. The two sides have held 2 rounds of consultations, with Japan consistently requesting the US reconsider its tariff measures. However, the US has insisted on not granting Japan special treatment for products such as automobiles and steel. After news broke that China and the US had reached a consensus, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba vowed on May 12 that Japan would take every possible measure to respond to US tariffs and, if necessary, would not hesitate to implement additional actions. It seems that Japan has also learned from China's ability to secure the greatest possible benefits. Meanwhile, another major economy, the European Union, finds itself in a much more awkward position. The European Union was one of the first economies to enter negotiations with the United States, but the US-EU talks have yet to achieve any breakthroughs. In an effort to break the deadlock, the EU even made concessions to the US last week and played the China card, promising to work with the US to address what they called China's excess production capacity. However, in the end, they gained nothing at all. Politico Europe published an article bluntly stating that the EU has been sidelined and dismissed by Trump. The article argues that a series of recent developments have exposed deep rifts between the US and Europe, once close allies. Desmarais, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, said that Europe is not a priority for the United States. He said that, in his view, whether it is in trade, defense, or any other area, Europe is not a priority for the US. This may come as a bit of a surprise to Europeans who are in discussions with US officials. The report mentions that on May 10th and 11th, high-level economic and trade talks between China and the United States were held in Geneva, Switzerland. Both sides agreed to lower tariffs within 90 days, reducing the rates by 115%. It is widely believed that this is an important step taken by the world's two largest economies in resolving their trade disputes. Prior to this, the United States reached an agreement with the United Kingdom last week to reduce tariffs on British car and steel exports. Trump immediately turned his attention to the European Union, sharply criticizing the EU for engaging in unfair trade practices, including setting barriers against imported American cars. He also predicted that the EU would make significant concessions to the United States on trade issues because the US holds all the cards. According to the European edition of Politico, the United States has reached agreements with both friends and rivals, while Brussels' calls for the US to reduce or exempt tariffs have gone unanswered. Trump placed transatlantic trade relations at the very end of the negotiation queue. Lipsky, a senior director at the US think tank Atlantic Council, stated that on America's list of priorities, countries like India, Japan, and even Vietnam rank ahead of the EU. After April, Trump announced the so-called reciprocal tariffs, setting the rate for the EU at 20%. In addition, the EU is also facing US tariffs of 25% on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. According to reports, the US and EU trade negotiation delegations have already held 3 meetings. Although both sides appeared smiling in group photos, the discussions have yielded little progress and only resulted in confusion. Even European officials are frustrated by this, believing that the US side lacks clear negotiation objectives and is simply making things up as they go along. An EU official familiar with the negotiations said, "This is just too absurd." This anonymous official admitted, when discussing the closed-door talks between the US and the EU, that reaching an agreement might still take several weeks, as the US seems to have repeatedly shifted its focus. According to data from Eurostat, in 2023, the United States was the largest export destination for EU products, with a value of €501.9 billion, followed by China at €223.5 billion. Meanwhile, China had the largest share of goods exports to the EU at €516.2 billion, followed by the United States at €346.7 billion. After Trump took a tough stance toward the EU on trade and security issues, many believed this would provide an opportunity to improve relations between the EU and China. But up to now, the EU's attitude toward China has remained hesitant and ambivalent. Last month, the European Commission's Deputy Director General for Trade and Economic Security, Mr. Platt, responded by saying that this notion is overly simplistic. What's even more ironic is that Canada and European countries who are also facing US tariffs and security threats have repeatedly played the China card to curry favor with the United States. EU Foreign Minister Karas has repeatedly claimed that a trade war between the United States and Europe would benefit China. At the G7 summit at the end of March, the G7 foreign ministers made comments on issues such as the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait in their statement, and even failed to mention the One China principle. Although Trump has already met with many European leaders, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has yet to confirm the timing of her meeting with Trump. Von der Leyen said last week that she would only meet with Trump if there were concrete trade proposals to negotiate. According to reports, in order to break the deadlock, the EU put forward a series of potential concessions last week, including easing digital regulations and working together to curb so-called Chinese overcapacity. At the same time, the EU threatened to impose tariffs on €100 billion worth of American goods if the negotiations stall. EU Trade Commissioner Šefčovič said on May 6 that after the United States launched trade investigations into pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, critical minerals, and other products, US tariffs could cover up to 97% of the EU's total exports to the US. He emphasized that such a tariff policy is unacceptable. If negotiations between the US and the EU fail, the EU will take retaliatory measures. In conclusion, at this point, European countries playing the China card to please the United States is useless. Sun Chenghao, an associate research fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University, said that if Europe thinks that playing the China card will help ease internal conflicts within the West, then their view is overly optimistic and simplistic. He said that one day the United States might shift more of its attention to China, but only if Europe makes significant concessions to the US on economic and trade issues. In fact, it has been proven that Europe's attempts to play the China card have failed to successfully win favor with the United States. As summarized in an article from Politico Europe, the US response to the EU's bargaining chips can be described as giving a slap and then offering a piece of candy. On one hand, Trump's hawkish trade advisor Navarro condemned the EU's countermeasures as highly provocative. On the other hand, some US officials have expressed optimism about US-EU negotiations, saying that trade talks between the United States and its partners, including the EU, are making continuous progress. According to Politico Europe, in Trump's eyes, the EU has almost no influence at all. The EU, on the other hand, hopes to adopt a strategy of patience and do its best to safeguard its own interests in negotiations with the United States. In conclusion, faced with such disdain from Trump, the EU's strongest card would be to quickly rebuild comprehensive cooperation with China. But clearly, EU leaders lack a sense of the bigger picture and the determination to make strategic adjustments and have already missed a golden opportunity.